It's time for Supply Chain Now. Broadcasting live from the supply chain capital of the country, Atlanta, Georgia. Heard around the world, Supply Chain Now spotlights the best in all things supply chain. The people, the technologies, the best practices, and the critical issues of the day. And now, here are your hosts.
Hey, good afternoon. Scott Luton and Greg White with you here on Supply Chain Now. Welcome back to today's show. Greg, we are really excited to have a repeat guest, but a very distinguished repeat guest on today's show, a leader in global trade and diplomacy. Are you as excited as I am?
I am. I feel like it's Old Friends Week. And I feel like this is going to be a better baseball day than the last time we talked. So
agreed. And no baseball today is better than the baseball that took place on that day. But so we're going to be talking about a lot of topics here today, but namely the USMCA. That's right. The new United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. It's referred to as CUSMA if you're listening to us in Canada, or if you're listening to us in Mexico, TMEX. So stay tuned for what will be a very informative show that's going to help raise your supply chain IQ. Quick programming note before we get started. If you enjoy today's podcast, hey, check out our podcast wherever you get your programming from. We publish Monday through Friday as we aim to cover and provide insights and perspective on global supply chain. Very busy world. All right, so no further ado, Greg, we must introduce our featured guest here today, Ambassador Javier Diaz de Leon, Consul General of Mexico in Atlanta. Consul Diaz, how are you, sir?
I'm very good. Thank you, Scott. Always great to see you. Great to see you, Greg, also. And,
thanks for joining us again.
No baseball today, but it's definitely better than the last time.
Yeah, that's right.
So we should shed a little light
for
some of our
folks,
listeners. Yeah. So the last time Greg actually interviewed Consul Diaz was at the 2019 Georgia Manufacturing Summit put on by our friends over at GMA. And it was the day of Game 5 in the playoff series between the St. Louis Cardinals and our beloved Atlanta Braves. And unfortunately, on that day, it was over after the first inning. And I cannot recall, there was double digits scored that the Cardinals scored in that first inning. I've kind of tried to forget the rest of the game. Braves went on to lose the series. But nevertheless, hey, the good news is baseball is back, evidently. And a 60-game series has been announced. So we'll have to talk baseball, hopefully, in the weeks to come.
No doubt. All
right, so Consul Diaz, last time we kind of had a quick hitter interview, and we want to dive deeper in your background as we start this one. Tell us a little about yourself. Tell us where you're from, and if you could, share a story or two about your upbringing.
Oh, of course. Thank you. I was born in Mexico City, a small town in my country. You might have heard about it. And I was born and raised there. Since I was young, of course, I went to school over there. But since I was very young, my parents had a lot of interest, particularly my mom. I always had a lot of interest in getting me to get very fluent in English. It was a very big thing back then. Now it's a lot more common. But back then, not everybody in Mexico was fluent in English, especially in middle-class families. And so she was very adamant about getting somewhere to get me, not only at school, but get me, practical experience to learn English and get involved in that sort of thing. And she managed to, through some friends, to get a connection with a family here in the United States in Charlotte, North Carolina. And we were connected with them through friends. And I started coming to the United States to spend summer at the home of this great family. I love them to death, and I know them for all my life. First time I came to their house in Charlotte, I was probably about 10 or 11 years old. But I did it almost every summer throughout most of my teenage years. So you can probably imagine a lot of times, my American young friends, there was a couple of guys there my age in that household. They would come over to Mexico sometimes, quite a few times to, as a reciprocity kind of thing.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Hey, a bond was created there. So I was very familiar with the South through all of my time and experience there in Charlotte. But of course, every time I would fly from Mexico City to Charlotte as a young boy, back then there was no direct flight from Mexico City to Charlotte, of course. So I would always fly through Atlanta. So I had a, personal experience going through the airport in this city from a very young experience, and always was good. I would never, back then, stop over in Atlanta, but I was flying to Charlotte. But I learned a lot about a lot of what at that point of time in my life, I didn't distinguish a lot about the Southern culture with, vis-a-vis the rest of the United States.
Right.
You don't really see things that way. You just go, I was in the U.S. But of course, as time went by, and one of the interesting things, very interesting things for me, of course, then I became years later, I became a Mexican diplomat, and I've worked in several offices and diplomatic offices in the United States. I started out way back when I started as a diplomat working at the Mexican embassy in Australia. But after that, it's been all U.S. So after Australia, I started in San Diego, New York, Washington, D.C. at the embassy. And then I got appointed in the United States in my first role as a Consul General. And when that happened in North Carolina.
Okay. So it took you, so it kind of came full circle for you.
It kind of came full circle, exactly. It wasn't in Charlotte because our consulate is in Raleigh, not in Charlotte. But again, anyway, it was kind of a very, big full circle for me going back to North Carolina as a diplomat.
So we're going to dive a little deeper into your professional journey in a minute, but let me ask you, as your mother had the good side of developing you from a bilingual standpoint, I'm very jealous. I wish I had spent more time learning other languages earlier. How helpful was the immersion of the that time you spent in Charlotte each year with the American family? How helpful was that with you to fine tune your ability to speak English?
No, I think it was definitely. It's a game changer.
Yeah,
totally. Because there's one thing about learning a language in the classroom, but of course, I was thrust upon this American family in a place like Charlotte. And let me tell you, this is about, about 40 years ago, something like that. And Charlotte 40 years ago was a very different place.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would probably say the same thing about Atlanta.
Sure.
And in many ways, but amongst them, back then, there were no Mexicans in Charlotte.
Right.
Wow.
Hardly anybody I met there knew any people from Mexico. And of course, there was no Spanish anywhere. Nobody spoke Spanish anywhere in an American city like Charlotte. So I had no choice. I had to survive and I had to speak English.
So I got to ask you, because you and we're going to talk more about this in a second, but your diplomatic journey, all these years of service you've had, the ability to meet new people and navigate policy, negotiate, get stuff done. How much of that, it sounds like to me, you had a great leg up of that as you were, as you spent time in Charlotte where you were having to meet new people and make those bridges and building those bridges. How instrumental was that experience to what you've spent your career doing?
I think it's definitely a great experience when you live abroad and when you have a large experience of living outside of your country, because you learn to understand that there are different viewpoints. Yep. And you learn to understand that, people from other countries are human. People from other countries might see things differently from people in your country, but it's usually a cultural thing. And cultural gaps can always be, closed. And of course, I never knew and had no idea back then that I would be working in the United States as a Mexican government representative. But of course, such a very wide experience, long experience of having so many American friends before, and knowing about American culture in ways that a lot of people outside the United States sometimes don't know. They don't go through the more deeper than, the stereotypes.
Right.
That is a tremendous tool.
Yes.
As a diplomat.
Agreed. All right, one last question. Your American friends that would go to Mexico and stay with your family, what was one thing that you think they had to really get over, just like you had to, get over when you were in Charlotte? Give us the goods on that.
First of all, they had to get over their fear of spicy food. I would say that would be the first thing. I mean, because yes, that is not a stereotype. We like spicy food. That's the way it should be done in our experience. And that's something they would really need to get through it.
Love
and of course the language barrier, because one of the things that we usually find is that and that was back then, it's still there. Again, it's a lot easier to find someone in Mexico City who speaks English, and there's less that is changing, fortunately, but it's less the case of American people who go to Mexico who speak Spanish. And a lot of times they expect Mexicans to speak English to them. And that happens a lot more often now than was the case, 35, 40 years ago.
Outstanding. All right, Greg, I got to give way.
Yeah, that was really interesting question, Scott, because what I was thinking was, I wondered, and we got the answer. Did your American friends learn to speak Spanish and come to Mexico to do so? And I suspected that they didn't.
But they learned a few words, but they never went, fully,
Yeah. So they must not have stayed for very long. I mean, when they came to visit, I'm guessing, because that would get difficult after a while, even in Mexico City, I would think. But typical, right? I mean, Europeans love to joke about Americans. Someone who doesn't have a passport and only speaks one language. That's us. Well, anyway, thank you for that. And I really, I think, man, it's amazing because we didn't talk about that before. And I totally get that whole full circle thing. And I thought I detected a bit of a Southern accent in you.
I don't know.
But, it's interesting because I, just real quick, I studied North Carolina. I was a political science major, and in the 80s, which might have been when you were there, I studied North Carolina. And at the time, North Carolina was the most populous state in the nation that didn't have a single city over 300,000 people. And that includes Charlotte, to give you some idea of what North Carolina and what Charlotte was like in those times, right?
I think it's changed a lot.
It has a lot. I mean, Charlotte is much, much bigger now. Even Raleigh and, in the technology triangle there is much, much, much bigger now. So we see how you kind of shaped yourself to become a diplomat, or how you and your mother, it sounds like, kind of worked together to do that. So tell us a little bit more about your role. Once you decide, I'd love to know how you decided to be a diplomat, and then maybe a little bit more about your role now that you're here in the Southeast, because you are the Consul General to Atlanta, but you cover a number of Southeastern states, correct?
True.
Okay.
I've been a diplomat for around 26 years. I'm not really counting, but something like that. And it's kind of those things that happen. There was an influence. I was always interested, maybe because of these personal experiences, traveling and going to foreign country, to the United States a lot. And my mom's brother was a diplomat.
Okay.
I was very young. I didn't have a lot of contact with my uncle because he was, he always lived in these faraway exotic places. And I saw him very little during my childhood. He's passed away now. So, but there was a little bit of an influence there, because he would come home every now and then and visit my grandparents, and I would see him, and he would talk about his life in these places outside the world, and that would probably make a little bit of an impression, I'm sure. And so the impression was there. But basically, I did study international political science and international politics, and I was doing a master's in England after that, when I got contacted by one of my teachers from college, who was a great mentor, and he was working at the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he contacted me saying, there is an opening, because there is a public contest in order to join the diplomatic corps. That's how it happens in the U.S. also too. It's competitive.
Yeah.
So he called me and told me, there's this going on. You should join. You should, put your name up and do the exams and try to get in. And I was in England at the time, and so I sent the paperwork. He helped me get the paperwork done and all that. He was really, and it worked perfect. I didn't plan it that way, but by the time I finished my master's in England, I had a job.
Wow.
I had a job coming back to Mexico into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it's basically, certain things that happen at a certain time, and the rest just goes from there. And I guess naturally, even though I started out in Australia, the embassy in Australia, which was a great experience, it was kind of inevitable that most of my work would end up being in the United States, because that was a natural thing for me, I guess, because of my life and many others. So, and that's what I've been doing for the past almost more than 20 years. And it's been very interesting because I've had the chance of experience very different perspectives of the relationship between our two countries. I started out in San Diego, so the border and the migration and the border issues, not only related to immigration, but also trade, and all those things are very important there. And that was a big way of perceiving the relationship, how it applies, how it happens at the border. And then, of course, New York, very different perspective, totally different perspectives. And then I had the chance to work at the Embassy of Mexico in the United States in Washington. And then again, that's where it's happening.
Right.
So that sort of prepared me very well to then, go to the local job of being the head of a consulate, like a place first in Raleigh and now here in Atlanta, I think. So it's kind of a long journey, around 20 years of journey, getting different perspectives, not only in terms of perspectives of the relationship between two countries, how it affects, how it works in different places, but also, of course, experiencing different cultures in the United States. I mean, I always say that I was transferred from San Diego to New York, and it was like moving to a different country in many ways. I mean, not only in terms of the distance, but culturally wise, people are completely different.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, that's a really unique part of the States that I think is difficult to recognize, because it is a vast physical space like Mexico and Canada. All the countries in North America are huge. Mm-hmm. There are vast cultural differences in the different regions. And I always chuckle a little bit when I'm in Europe. At least they have clear boundaries, right? And they say, "You Americans," and then whatever they say, and I'm like, okay, now which Americans are you talking about?
Right.
I mean, it's almost like there are multiple Americas, and it's likewise in Canada and in Mexico, right?
I think it's part of human nature. I mean, people like to classify things and because it makes it easier to think about things. But of course, in my experience, and I'm sure it's yours too, almost always things are a lot more complicated, a lot more complex.
Yeah.
And of course, the United States is a very complex country with enormous specificities in different regions and different people and different cultures within the country. Right. It's obvious, but sometimes for people, for example, in Mexico, it's not so obvious because they tend to, pigeon box things and people. And again, same thing applies to Mexico. I mean, we are a country of tremendous cultural differences between the North and the South and the Gulf and the Pacific, and Mexico City and Guadalajara and Monterrey. We're all Mexicans, but we're very different. We speak the same language, technically.
Right. Well, yeah, and it's anyway, you see a lot of those sort of groupings, right? Whatever they are. And I think it's good that you got to see that. Probably natural that you were able to discern that, having started in the South, then going west and then to the Northeast. So I think it's really a benefit to be able to do that, frankly. And I hope that more people get to do that, to experience outside their own country. And I mean, really experience it like you have. So, well, okay. So I imagine, other than your uncle, which it sounds like we may have just discovered on this show, had maybe more influence on you than maybe even you realized till now. But other than that, who else or what events kind of helped shape your worldview or your perspective on things, or what you're passionate about, or anything like that?
I think I mean, the way my career developed, it's not something that is kind of planned, but the bureaucracies tend to also talking about what we were saying, bureaucracies tend to pigeonhole people. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that in the sense that at some point in my career, I've been pigeonholed in terms of this guy works in the United States. This guy does consulates in the United States. That's his thing. We have other people who do, multilateral organizations at Geneva or at the United Nations in New York, or people who are specialized in Asia or things like that. And that's how, there's groups that are me. I'm this guy who he's good at the U.S.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm trying to say in a little bit is that through my perspective, I think I started out in the border, but I started out also that created a very specific discovery for me, because even, we people in Mexico City sometimes don't perceive the border correctly. And I think that applies in the United States too. People who have never been in the border, who are sometimes in the interior, in places like Atlanta or Chicago or New York or DC, and they've never been in the border, and that happens again in Mexico too. We think we know what's going on there, but if you're not there, and you've never been there, you probably don't really understand the nature of the dynamics of our border. And that is, I think that to me was an eye opener, because how thick and how complex are our relationships in the border, and how much people on both sides of the border need each other and work with each other every day. And sometimes they get together, people from Tijuana and San Diego, or people from, McAllen and Reynosa, you name it. El Paso,
Mexicali and Calexico, yeah.
Or Juarez and El Paso, whatever,
yeah.
And they have a lot more in common with each other in their daily lives than they have with Mexico City or Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, Mexico City and Washington, D.C. is a problem for them, because they don't let them live and do the things that they would like to do. And so everything that involves the very complex relationship of our countries, because we usually pigeonhole our relationship, again, I like that word, around a couple of issues, migration and trade. And of course, yeah, but our relationship is very, very complex. It goes through almost any issue that you can think of: environment, history, culture, language. It all is connected to the relationship between our countries. We share millions of families. There are millions of families in the United States and in Mexico, right, that have mixed citizenship of our countries. There are Americans who live in Mexican households in Mexico, people who were born in America, or American citizens who live in Mexico with Mexican families, and the other way around also too. So we share people, we share history, and we share, of course, millions and billions of dollars in trade and economic relationship. I mean, you know very well, that's why we're here.
Right.
But it's a lot more than that. And all of that happens in the border. All of that happens, you can see it and live it in the border. So to me, my experience in the border, which was my first experience as a diplomat in the United States, was so intense. I was there 5 years, and it opened really my eyes about how complex things are between our two countries. And by complex, I don't mean bad. I just mean complex.
Right.
Yeah.
It's much different. Yeah.
So I worked for an auto parts chain based in Phoenix, and we had stores on both sides of the border in San Diego and Calexico and Juarez and all over there. And I have to tell you, it was amazing, the similarities of culture to those cities that are on both sides of the border, regardless of whether it was Americans on the American side or Americans on the Mexican side or vice versa. It is very similar. And that is sort of a connector, if you will, whether we mean for it to be or not. It is a connector between our two countries. And
to most of those communities in the border is an opportunity. The border represents an opportunity. It gives them, in many ways, in terms of their economic activity, it gives them an edge. It gives them something they have that probably some other parts of Mexico and the United States don't have. So that is so when you move from there to other parts of the United States, I was suddenly surprised about sometimes the perspective that is sometimes portrayed in the interior of the United States about the border. There's not a lot of knowledge about what really the border is like, and there's this perception that it is like this wild area where there's no authorities, there are no infrastructure, anybody can come and go anywhere whenever they want because there's nothing there, which is not true. And there is this perspective basically of the border as a source of threat, the danger area, and everything that the border means is a threat. And I'm not saying that the border does not involve security issues. Of course they do, and that's those things that we need to, and we do work together on a daily basis.
Right.
But there's really a lot of recognition about how important that border working the way it should is so important for lives of people in both of our countries.
So let's talk about that opportunity thing you were just talking about, right? I mean, USMCA goes into effect July 1st, and with everything going on in the world, it's almost as if people have forgotten about that.
Right.
To pigeonhole people and give a gross generalization.
Well, Greg,
but let's talk about that.
Yeah. So it's like we talked about pre-show. All the conversations we have with business leaders, supply chain leaders, leaders that undoubtedly, whether the USMCA impacts all of the enterprise or the portion that's here in North America, and it's not been forefront. In fact, we were so fortunate to have Consul Diaz on the show and have an expert kind of within access to come back on, because to your point, it's July 1st. It's going into effect, and this pandemic, no pandemic, it doesn't matter. It is here, and it's going to be impacting operations. So Consul Diaz, with that, I'm not going to speak for Greg. I am not a trade policy wonk or analyst or historian. However, as we've done our homework for this show, I understand that USMCA replaces the 26-year-old NAFTA, which I find interesting. NAFTA was being implemented about the time that you were entering your years of serving as a trade ambassador. And what we loved about your last appearance, Greg, one of the things, because you one heck of an interview with Consul Diaz last time, Greg.
Yeah, we should put that in the show notes.
Agreed. One of the great things that Consul Diaz shared last November as USMCA was being negotiated and whatnot was that when NAFTA was implemented, there was no such thing as digital trade. So naturally, NAFTA wasn't going to take into account things like that, which of course is everywhere and then some these days. So shed a little background, like before we dive into USMCA and what business leaders need to know, shed a little background on why the need for the new replacement for NAFTA.
Yeah, of course. And I think you just mentioned it, Scott. I mean, NAFTA at that point was a very groundbreaking trade agreement. We grew accustomed to it, and we knew it was there, but maybe 26 years later, it's not as easy to remember. But the world was very different back then. In 26, I could tell. Mexico was very different.
Sure.
Mexico was definitely a very different country. Mexico was an emerging, still, of course, an economy that was a very closed economy for a long time. One of the most protectionist economies in the world, and was based on an import substitution model that involved basically, stopping goods coming into the country, and we're going to build our own and all that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And during the mid 80s, Mexico started changing. We got into the GATT, and we started embracing free trade. And then, I mean, to a lot of people's surprise in my country, the government said, we're going to do this with the United States. Mexico had never done a free trade agreement before with anybody before doing it with the United States.
Wow, okay.
So this was our first free trade agreement, so that is something.
Yeah.
If we remember right, I mean, the United States had already done its free trade deal with Canada. Mm-hmm. So that was already done. So we started, we hopped into the agreement that Canada and the US had done, and it became a trilateral agreement. Now, that is important. But the other important thing about NAFTA is that it was, at that point, the first ever free trade agreement between developed economies and a developing economy.
Right.
Mexico was the first developing economy in the world to enter into free trade with a developed economy. And
Wow.
that
In the
might
world?
mean a lot or not. Sorry?
In the world, that was the first time
A developing economy had a free trade agreement with a
Wow.
developed economy.
So, Consul, we were all so young then. We probably didn't realize the the significance of that. But that is, huge. I mean, if you think about that, that is huge, because that is so natural today for that to happen.
Yeah,
what a breakthrough!
It's become, you know, because the liberalization of trade and the globalization of world economy has become, of course, a given to many of us. But that was not the case in the early 90s, end of the 80s, etc.
Yeah.
The world was moving in. And in Mexico's perspective, it was not only, you know, for the first time ever opening its economy, it was opening its economy to the biggest economy in the world. Mm. So it's not a, so from the perspective of a lot of people in Mexico, there was a deal, there was a trade deal that was going to transform us. And it did. I mean, but some people were, you know, afraid, very afraid of it, because they would say, oh, we're going to lose our identities. We're going to lose tacos, and all of us are going to start eating hamburgers and hot dogs. And there'll be no tacos left in Mexico because we're going to become Americans.
That'd be a travesty.
That would be a travesty.
I mean,
right.
I'm sort of trivializing it.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I could see that. And I think we had a prominent politician, right? Ross Perot, his famous term, the giant sucking sound, right? Because there was fear everywhere, right? The fear was that all the jobs would go to Mexico.
And that's on the other side. I mean, on the side of the United States, of course, uncertainty. Nobody has done a free trade with a country like Mexico, which has, of course, wages which are very different, and the economy is very different to the United States. How does that work? How does that translate? And so we went through that. And Mexico was transformed economically. Mexico has become one of the most open economies in the world. We have free trade with over 40 countries now in the world. And of course, Mexico has become a manufacturing hub, which was not the case of us. We used to be an oil-based economy, pretty much like what Venezuela is now. That is not Mexico anymore. Mexico is, I mean, has oil, of course. We do have oil, but Mexico is a manufacturing economy.
Right. And it'd be really interesting in the months to come to see what new industry opportunities come to all of North America based on some of these resourcing decisions, procurement decisions that are bound to have some fallout. All right. So clearly you I love how you frame up kind of the NAFTA history, the impact, clearly the huge impact, and now the need to update and replace it with USMCA. So now let's talk about what that means for business leaders in Mexico, in the U.S., and Canada, or international organizations that have parts of the enterprise here in North America. What are some of the big impacts here as it goes into effect? Well, by the time this publishes, it will already have been implemented.
I mean, first of all, I mean, one very important thing is that, of course, and it's not a minor thing now in the global economy. What the USMCA brings to the table now is, first of all, certainty in a global trade environment that, as you know, is far from certain in many ways. So there's a lot of concern everywhere about what's going to happen in terms of potential trade wars with other regions in the world, etc. And North America is positioned starting next week when USMCA comes into force in a very distinct competitive advantage because we have certainty, and we have certainty related, especially particularly around what you do, supply chains.
Right.
That is not the case for most of the rest of the world. They're living in a context of uncertainty because they don't know where the next trade war is going to happen. They don't know where the next tariff is going to be put up.
Right.
They don't know about the access of markets and investment and manufacturing among other regions. And we certainly know what's going to happen in our region because we were careful to do that. The new USMCA has very specific provisions in terms of how, for example, car manufacturing industry in North America is going to look like in North America for the next few years. First of all, there was a threshold included in the USMCA to increase the level of regional content of what we do in North America and other when we make cars. There's a thing of a thing.
Well, if I can interject,
country of origin rules.
Right, the rules of origin, right.
Consul
Rules
Diaz,
of origin.
back on that automotive point, that, if I understand you correctly, that's going to make the clustering, it's a little more than that, but the clustering that's across all three countries make really that regional automotive industry more competitive against the rest of the world. Is that?
Well, I think that's what the leaders of our three countries decided and saw they wanted to move towards. I think before, I mean, the NAFTA requirement for a car to be considered a NAFTA car, whatever you want to call that, but a NAFTA car, it would mean that 62.5% of the content of that car was regional, was Canadian, American, Mexican, 62.5. This negotiation upped the level for that. Now it's going to be 75%.
That's
so at least 75% of the car needs to be parts and manufacturing and content that was done here in this region. So that is closing a significant part from other regions in the world who have been, sending parts and machinery and pieces from other parts of the world. And we are creating a much regionally stronger supply chain in terms of cars here in North America. That is a big difference. And that's going to create a lot of opportunities for companies in the US, Canada, and Mexico.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that it doesn't just impact American or Mexican or Canadian brands, because Volkswagen and BMW and other brands manufacture cars in the Americas. And for it to be considered manufactured in America means that more of the products have to be sourced here.
Correctly. And that means that a lot of those car companies, manufacturers, like the ones you mentioned, which are Japanese or European, which have, of course, very big, important manufacturing bases here in the South, of course, will have to do a lot of the production here, sometimes part of the production that they were doing in other regions in the world. So, for example, there are plants here in Georgia from the Kia plant here in Georgia that is a strong economic actor, has a strong role here in Georgia, and they have a connection with the Kia plant in Monterrey, Mexico. And so a lot of the supply chain that goes between these plants in North America will be stronger, will have to be stronger with less content from plants or from products or other parts of the world.
Hey, Consul Diaz, one of the things I understand, and to be fair, it's been probably 10 or 11 years, maybe 12, 13 years since I managed shipments for manufacturers coming across borders. But I understand that documentation, the compliance documentation, is going to streamline that, including electronic documentation. And rather than rely on just one form that was accepted, it's going to allow for a variety of different formats for this documentation, which can be a headache for supply chain practitioners, getting stuff in and out of different countries.
So, yeah, I mean, so a lot of the elements also that we also discussed were to streamline procedures.
Yes.
To have common guidelines and common documentation among the three countries to make us streamline. Because again, I mean, our competitive edge as a region is not only in terms of how competitive we are in terms of pricing for manufacturing, but also transportation edges and access to close suppliers of parts, and that needs to work easily, and that's connected to what I was talking about before. For example, in the border,
right?
We need a border that is efficient, that goods come and go easily, fast, and efficiently in our border, because we have a trade relationship between U.S. and Mexico that's over $500 billion, and most of that trade goes through the border. So things like that, which are regulation streamlining is critical.
Yeah, it's tough to move $500 billion worth of anything. So why not make it easier? Make it a lot easier and make it poised for growth and more regionally competitive.
And of course, we need to think about it always with a perspective of making sure that the border works efficiently, without taking our mind off the security elements, of course. So we need to make sure that those things we want to cross that easily through the border do so, and those things that we do not want things to cross the border easily do not.
Right. Have we defined that in USMCA fairly well, would you say?
I mean, of course, the USMCA is mostly about trades, but it does consider and it talks about how we need to set up a specific procedures and protocols in our border to streamline those things that are created on trade fluxes that are based on agreed protocols from our countries that will streamline the process of crossing the border for goods. And we have done a lot of that throughout the years. We have evolved on that a lot. There's a lot of pre-checking of custom pre-checking, U.S. customs pre-checking happening in Mexico before, so things cross fast in the border. So we have developed that. I know that happens in Canada too. So we have a lot of very good experience now that we did not have when we first started with NAFTA.
Yep. Hey, when we reached out to your office, Consul Diaz, we also reached out to the Canadian Consul General in Atlanta, and we hope to have her on soon. I understand y'all collaborate quite a bit, and you're on panels a lot, and you speak together. Love that.
She's amazing. She's actually an expert, not me. She is an expert. She knows what she's talking about. So I'm sure she will reach out to you soon. She loves to talk about this, I know, because that's her really ballpark, and she's really great about these sort of matters.
Well, all right. So you mentioned, and that's Consul Theodore. I had a little lapse real quick. Consul Theodore, yeah. Yes. You mentioned automotive industry. Clearly, is USMCA is poised to have a great impact there. Any other industries that really come to mind that you should, if they are, and I'm sure they're already tracking this already, but for our audience that may not be in positions to navigate through the USMCA policy?
First of all, of course, the agricultural part of free access between our countries remained exactly the same. So, I mean, there is basically no tariffs for agricultural trade between our countries. There are, of course, in some products, some sanitary, issues that all of our countries have in place. But in terms of tariffs, free trade is there. There were some discussions about changing that, but that was avoided. So that's very good news. Intellectual property is also one of the key elements that are in the new agreement that were not present before. So very strong agreements and very strong locks into the system are there to protect intellectual property. Of course, we already talked about digital trade. There is a full chapter on digital trade in the agreement that, of course, wasn't there back then. I should add also, of course, some sectors, some very interesting, important sectors like energy are very important now in this USMCA, because when NAFTA was agreed upon, the Mexican energy sector was very different from what it is now. So that is something to keep in mind also.
Yep. Holy cow, we're going to have to get a copy of the entire policy, Greg, and we're going to have to go through it page by page. Sounds like it's chock full of good stuff that's good for industry, but also good for the special relationship that Consul Diaz was talking earlier.
I think the way we see it, and I say we because I think it's all three countries, is that this is a 21st century trade agreement, and it's in many ways this is something that many countries in the world we had done before, especially when we negotiated the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was done a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, and it included all of these new global economy elements into that. But of course, the United States decided not to partake in that. So once the United States is not in there, we needed to have a 21st century agreement with the United States, because of course it's our number one trade economic partner in the world.
Right. Right. And you gave us some numbers on Mexico and the southeast of the U.S., the area that you cover in terms of the trade there. Can you share with our listeners how?
Yeah, of course. I mean, in the case of Georgia and Mexico, for example, our total trade the last number we have, of course, is 2019. And in 2019, our total trade was over $11 billion,
Wow.
which is, tremendous. Mexico is the second buyer in the world of Georgia. And guess who is the number one? Canada.
Canada, of course, yeah.
That was a trick question.
They love peaches.
So, and this is actually a quick trick question, because most often when I do this thing and ask that, the most common answer I get a lot of times, people say China. There's this perception. No, it's Canada, and then it's Mexico. In terms of countries in the world who buy Georgia goods, so I mean that is there, and it's very. So the size of the relationship has evolved, and the other very important thing is that the numbers keep growing every year. And last year, exports from Georgia to Mexico were over $41 billion. So,
wow. How do you reconcile those two numbers, the 11 and the 41 billion? So tell me the difference between those numbers.
The difference with those numbers.
So so 11 billion is Mexican goods consumed in Georgia, correct?
11.3 billion was the total trade both ways between Mexico and Georgia.
Okay.
Between Mexico and Georgia. And I think I just made a mistake because I told you the total exports of Georgia to the world in 2018 were 41 billion.
Oh, gotcha. Got it. Okay.
So that means I'm sorry, and that was my mistake. But that basically means that around 25% of the total trade of Georgia in the world was with Mexico.
Wow.
Critical for the state.
Of the total exports of Georgia to the world were sent to Mexico. So that puts things in a certain perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's make that easier. Let's streamline that. Let's grow it.
That's a good question, or a good jumping off point here on USMCA. Reducing friction is essentially the goal of USMCA. Correct?
Correct.
It's to make trade more accountable, but also a little bit easier than for some of the aspects. One that NAFTA didn't cover, like digital trade, like we talked about, and other areas where it did not effectively reduce friction.
And I think that it recognizes a lot. I mean, I see a lot of it goes into supply chains and manufacturing and all that. It's a recognition that the relationship and our economic relationship has evolved to more of a manufacturing hub, because when you think basically of a trade-free agreement, people a lot of times think about basically trading finished goods.
Right.
We sell you tequila and avocados, and we buy your peaches. And that's fine. That is true. That happens. True. But it's a lot. It's not. That's not really what we're about. If you see the nature of the products that Georgia buys from, and that's the United States in general, of course, but Georgia buys from Mexico, or the other way around. Yes, it's not really about tequila and peaches. It's about machinery. It's about cables. It's about vehicle parts.
Yeah.
That's really so. That's what USMCA is about. It's about how are we going to be competitive as a manufacturing power in the world, in the global economy.
All right. So on that note, you finished with the global economy. Greg, we like to kind of see what's on his mind, right?
I can't.
What else?
Yeah. I recall when we talked before that you mentioned those numbers, 25% of all trade with Georgia is with Mexico. I recall you saying that now, but it's still it's really a shocking number. I mean, but I guess we should expect that.
Right.
It's a huge economy. It's relatively proximate. I mean, Mexico is close, right? So it seems natural when you think
Mexico
of it.
Mexico is the 13th largest economy in the world.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So let's speaking of that global business economy and speaking of things beyond USMCA, and we're going to have you come back on with us, Consul Diaz, and once everything gets implemented, maybe we can talk through the first couple months of how things play out as the USMCA gets implemented. Maybe we get Consul Theodore to join you, but let's talk about everything else in global business. As you survey this challenging year that is 2020, this pandemic environment, and hopefully we're breaking through. We're seeing a number of different numbers, but what else is on front and center for you? What other trend or topic or issue? What are you talking about with your fellow trade ministers and other business people around the world right now?
Well, I mean, it's a big trend around how the global economy is moving towards a more local looking inward instead of globally. There's of course a lot of concern about possible trade wars, and in all regions of the world. Of course, everybody thinks about the United States and China, but it's happening in many other regions in the world. So that brings uncertainty, about tariffs and a lot of putting our jobs and our manufacturing first before buying goods from other countries in the world, and so it's uncertain in terms of the future for the global economy the way we saw it a few years ago. A lot of things that we're seeing is that a lot of companies are looking into strategies to work around avoiding getting caught by tariffs, and some of the emerging tariffs that are happening here in the United States, in Asia, in Europe, or in other regions in the world. And we have seen increased imports in Mexico of North American companies that are tweaking their supply chains to reroute around China, because they don't want to get caught in these tariff wars that are
not good for anybody.
Yeah. So of course, smart business goes where they see a safe haven from uncertainty. And we are seeing a large number of that happening. I personally have been involved recently with a lot of inputs and contacts from companies in the IT sector that are interested in learning about the opportunities for their companies in Mexico as a production hub, as a place where they can replace uncertainty that they are finding in other parts of the world in order to take advantage of something like USMCA. The second also thing is that, and it's also connected to this previous idea, the second trend I want to talk about, and we sort of mentioned it a little bit, is that a localization in supply chains and communications. With this uncertainty in the global economy, we are seeing a lot of, supply chains and big manufacturing hubs are looking for more local supply chains, people who will be their suppliers that are locally and closer to their production place, instead of bringing some parts or machinery from the other side of the world.
Right.
Not only because of costs, but also because uncertainty vis-a-vis, tariff wars and all that. And that is exactly what, North America is about. And that's why we are placed in a very, very advantageous position that no other region in the world has at this point. And that is something that, in this context, there is a very different perspective of the way you see the political economy and the political viewpoint between the leaders of North America, how we see each other as partners, and we don't see each other as threats in terms of our manufacturing activity. And that is not exactly necessarily how we are acting towards the rest of the world. So there is this trend of, regional agreements, regional powerhouses, and we are already in place in North America.
Yeah, and we have 26 plus years of experience in working together, right, for manufactured goods. Scott and I talk about this a lot ever since COVID has come up. There's a lot of talk about reshoring or nearshoring or sure shoring or whatever shoring we're talking about. And of course, Mexico and Canada come up in those discussions. Mexico more so because the workforce is so much larger, and economically it fits as well, right?
So it's a thing of access to the necessary, the necessary elements in the production chain that you need, and you need workers. You need highly trained workers. You need communication channels. You need streamlined processes. We have all that, and I think we've become pretty good at it in our region. And our competitors in other regions in the world, I don't think they can say the same. I mean, Europe has big problems in terms of who they are. Do they actually want to be together for the next few years? You know what happened with Brexit, and
right.
Of course the Asian area is a lot more in flux also. So we in North America, I think again, we need to think of ourselves more as North Americans and less as just Canadians, Mexicans, and Americans. We are
right.
I agree. We have a lot less. We have a lot fewer real borders or perceived borders, and frankly, a lot fewer cultural differences than even what we tend to call Europe. You know, we think of Europe as a place. Some people even think of Africa as a country, right? But those are vastly different cultures, and they are dozens of them within relatively small proximity. We cover an enormous portion of the world's population and physical space with just 3 countries.
And I think we're a little bit of victims of our success in the sense that we're NAFTA or North America gets kind of taken for granted.
Right.
And it's very common when we attend panels or conferences when they're talking about global trade, etc. And there's always a lot of talk about finding this new market in Asia, or this great opportunity in a certain market in Africa or in South America, which is fine. I mean, we already got it. So a lot of people talk about what we're already doing in North America,
right.
and maybe we can always be a lot stronger and fortify what we already do instead of putting so much attention to new exciting markets.
Well put. All right, so I hate to start to wrap up the conversation, but when we started and you started talking about spicy food, you started making me really hungry, Consul Diaz. So I've got to catch a late lunch or maybe a second lunch. I don't know. So let's make sure folks can connect with you. I mean, I really, through a couple of conversations now, Greg, your worldview, Consul Diaz, on economies, on industrial, on the background, the history, as well as those points that connect us all, especially here in North America. That is that's some really good stuff, and it's clear that you study your craft, and that might sound naive or obvious, but to know your history and to be able to kind of deconstruct things as you do, it really makes for the layman like us, Greg. Actually, Greg may be
certainly not USMCA experts,
right? It really makes it easier to understand, and really, frankly, exciting about this next chapter that hopefully will spur a lot of growth amongst the 3 countries. So, how can folks connect with you, Consul Diaz, you and the Mexican consulate right here in Atlanta?
Well, there's different ways, because we have of course, all our social media. We have our page in Facebook, of course. Our Twitter is at ConsulMexATL, at ConsulMexATL. So you can contact us through Twitter. My Twitter account is at CGJDL, and that's the easy way when anybody can contact us anytime.
Outstanding. Of course, we'll include those links so that folks can reach out, right?
Do you want to give us Marcella's Twitter handle?
Oh,
probably should not do that.
I wish I could, but I don't have it good. I don't
That's
have
good.
It good.
That's good.
We're kidding. Well, what a great conversation. I really appreciate you spending some time with us to walk through this next chapter and share some of the things that folks, especially business leaders, really need to understand about the USMCA, which by the time, again, this is released, it will have been implemented, and companies, Greg, will be navigating through the change, right?
I already like USMCA better because I feel like we're approaching it with hope and not fear, right? And I can say this because I'm not a diplomat or even diplomatic, but I feel a lot better having tight trade ties with our neighbors than someone to whom we are just that vast nation across the ocean, right? And we have a lot of we have a lot of combined interests, and it works. We can work together to benefit one another. Physical proximity, cultural proximity, and all of that works to help us become better partners and to help each other thrive. Right?
Totally. I mean, there are no two countries in the world who have more invested interest in America's prosperity than Canada and Mexico.
Yeah.
And
we likewise, right? I mean, I think it's likewise, and that's the beautiful thing of it. We only have a few borders, right? We don't have dozens or hundreds of borders like you do in other parts of the world, and it just makes it that much easier. We're only talking about 3 entities here to cover the entirety of North America.
Correct. So that's the way we see it. I think we're also excited, and we're looking forward to where the USMCA takes us. But again, I mean, we know what happened the past 26 years, and we are in a better position now. So
agreed.
Let's look forward to this. Thank you.
Agreed. Well, hey, thanks so much. We've been chatting with Ambassador Javier Diaz de Leon, Consul General of Mexico in Atlanta. Thanks so much, sir, for your time here today. We look forward to having you back on maybe in a couple months as everything plays out. Don't go anywhere just yet. Greg and I are going to wrap up this episode of Supply Chain Now. Greg, love this stuff. You know, it's in demand. We've been asked about it numerous times. We're so fortunate to have experts right here in our backyard that know how to deconstruct things and make it easy for non-policy wonks, huh?
Yeah, and that's the really natural thing. I'm going to speak about you like you're not here, Consul Diaz, but anyone can understand this discussion, right? Whether you know a whole lot about USMCA or even international trade or even the state of Georgia or America or Canada or Mexico, you can understand this, and it takes an exceptional gift to be able to speak about such world-shaping things, activities, so that the rest of us can understand it. And I really appreciate that. And we do appreciate your time, and do thank Marcella for helping us schedule this. She's been really helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's being bilingual and being able to decipher what's taking place and share it. That's a language in and of itself. So I really appreciate that. To our audience, if you enjoyed this discussion, there are certain elements of it that will play out in our July 15th event, where we talk more about the state of race in industry. And we're going to have a very frank conversation along some different lines, but, you know, conversations that need to be had so that we can make for a better environment, a better industry, and more opportunities for all. So, but check out that event, July 15th, and all the rest of the resources, podcasts, live streams that we have at supplychainnowradio.com. Greg, I'm going to wrap it up here. As much as we've enjoyed this conversation, we invite our audience to check out the very next episode. Hey, and along those lines, we encourage you to, you know, do good, give forward, and be the change that is needed today. And on that note, we will see you next time here on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.